turning 40, it's very easy to get lost in the fact that, you're the rave of the moment. But the moments have had many raves. I'm a completely made in Nigeria product. Born, bred, and buttered. The work was a lot of my life because I started working at the age of 15. And there were many times when I cried because I was a hot-headed young man at the time. And so at some point in my 20s, I had a nervous breakdown because it was just too much pressure. My TV experience is very wide-ranging. I produced shows for Comfort, Okoronkwo, Video 10 on NTA, it was on the network. I produced Inside Out with Agatha for a number of years. I was production coordinator and I was producer. I was worried about poverty because authors are not well respected in Nigeria, and I could see that this could be my life. And I knew that I couldn't afford to be poor in a country like Nigeria.
Come for me.
It's especially nice to get to sit with you and talk about a few things, ask you a few things about what you've been into, and I'm glad I'm here talking to you.
I'm honored.
Chude.
I'm honored.
Right, and let me just say congratulations. In a very short while now, it'll be 40? 40, right, actually. And that's a fantastic age. Also,
I've been told.
Also reminds me when I was 40. It's a long time ago, I can't remember that. But the first thing I'd like to say to you, how does a 40-year-old get to pack in so much that you've been able to do within just this 4 decades?
I've never actually been asked that. I don't have a good answer for it. I've just known that I've always wanted to do things since I was a child. Just wanted to do things. And I'd always been fascinated by people who did things. And so for my teens, it was always necessary for me to create, to produce. It's almost as if I always had a sense that the time was going. Now, as I get older,
Right.
I've begun to slow down because there's also life to enjoy, to live. But when I was a teenager, I just wanted to do so much. I don't know where it came from. I don't know why it was that way, but I don't think anything particularly happened. I just wanted to do stuff.
Used to be with the late Levi Ajuonuma on television. That was your first romance with TV. So how did that come across to you?
So it's a very interesting story. I'd written a novel when I was in high school. It was published while I was writing my final WAEC exams. And my publisher was based in Ibadan and didn't understand how publicity worked in the modern media space at the time. Because 1990 to 2000, democracy was coming. Those independent TV stations, all that dynamic, and he was based in Ibadan. But I was a couch potato. I was watching everything on television. I was reading all the newspapers, I knew the columnists, I knew the editors, I knew the producers, because I used to joke the first time I met Mr. Peter Igo and interviewed his son, I used to say, after you watch every show, you will say executive producer Peter Igo, executive producer Peter Igo. So I would read the end credits and know who was who. And so when I came out of my WAEC exams, I wanted people to know about the book. And so I would just walk into TV stations and find the producers and give them my book and say, I would like to talk about my book. But with Levi Ajuonuma, it was completely different. I was in church. He used to attend the church called Mountain of Fire and Miracles. And there's a program there called the Deliverance Program. And one day we were praying, and I said the church has a peculiar way of praying. And I was praying, and I looked back, and I saw Levi Ajuonuma. And I told my mother, oh my God, that's Levi Ajuonuma. And she said, so go talk to him. And so when the prayer sessions were over for the day, I walked up to him and said, I'd written this book. It was on the official reading list for Ogun State at the time. And I wanted to talk about the book. And he invited me to his office in Surulere and read the book and then called me back. He used to call me Chido. And called me back and said, this is a fantastic book. Yes, you should certainly be on my show. And that's how I became a guest on the show. I got on the show as a guest. And then in the middle of, he had this interesting way, he didn't have a live audience, but he would talk to the camera like he had a live audience. And so in the middle of interviewing me, he suddenly pecks up and says, "This is such a bright young man." I can never forget it because it meant a lot to me. Viewers, I think we should give him a segment on the show. And that's how he offered me a segment on the show. And that's how my career in television started.
Right, and you got on television. Of course, back then, the NTA was where to be, held sway. But you were such a young man and you were on television and on NTA. That gave you some airs, didn't it?
Oh, it certainly did. I mean, not airs. I've always learned, because I spend a lot of time with older people, to keep my ego in check. But it certainly gave me a lot of confidence. That was when I began to be recognized on the streets. People would say, "Oh, you're the guy with Levi," you know. And yes, it was incredibly validating. It was such a gift to give a young teenager, to say to this person that you're so talented or you're so bright that you deserve. I didn't even know that it was legal for anybody below 18 to be on TV. So it certainly gave me an incredible amount of validation. And Levi Ajuonuma himself was a very warm and collegial person. And so there was a sense in which he treated me not even as a mentee, but also as a pair, almost like a pair, even though I knew, of course, I wasn't his pair. And he introduced me, and I was friends with his. So that gave me the foundational validation to know that I had talent.
At some point in time, here you were with Funmi Iyanda. And I'm wondering, who produces a program at that level at age 19?
One day I was sitting outside the studio, and she drives in into the NTA studios in Channel 10. And so I walk up to her, and I say, and she was being produced by Lolade Adewuyi, who is now hosting the show on the NTA. And she was with her, and I just walked up to her and said, "My book," and then she read it. And then I went on her show. And it was a beautiful interview. And then a few months after, Funmi sends me a message herself and says, "I want to meet with you. I want to discuss something with you." And I was in the University of Lagos studying law at the time. And my mother said to me, "She's going to offer you a job." And I'm like, "No, she can't offer me a job. This is too big. This is," she was huge at the time. And again, I still didn't think, because with Levi Ajuonuma, it was a bit of an informal arrangement.
Right.
But with Funmi, my mother said this was going to be a job. And again, I didn't think it was legal for a person who hadn't graduated from university to even be offered a proper job. And so then I went to the meeting, and Funmi said to me, "You're a couch potato." It was as if she had known me all my life. And you are passionate about television, and this is what you want to be, and this is who you want to be. And then she offered me my very first paid job as a researcher on New Dawn. And so I did that for about a year. I think I was 16 at the time. Or 16 or 17 at the time. I think I was 17. So I did that. I was working with the producer then, Demilade Resonya. Demilade. And 1.5 years later, he left the show. And he left. And Funmi just said, "Okay, you're the producer now." And I thought she was insane.
You didn't feel this was daunting?
It certainly was daunting. But it was also exciting. So it was daunting, but one thing I've always not done in my life, I've never pretended not to want what I want. Mm-hmm. Okay. I've always found it strange. And even though I never thought this was going to happen, when it happened, I welcomed it. Because I loved the show, and I loved television, and I loved working with Funmi. And it was daunting. I didn't know the first thing about it, but I welcomed it. and so I just slipped into it. Like, there was no training. There was no... In fact, I remember one day I had invited the late Raymond Dokpesi as a guest on the show. And in the night, he had cancelled. And this was my first experience with a big guest cancelling. And I texted Funmi and said, "He has cancelled. I don't know what to do." And she ignored me. And so I called him back. And I said, "Sam, I'm going to lose my job if you don't come on the show tomorrow." And the next day he came. And he told her, he said to Funmi, he said, do not lose this young man. But then Funmi told me that she deliberately ignored my message because she knew I could solve the problem and she needed me to know that I could. And so that was the kind of leadership. She made it easy to grow into this. And there were many times when I cried because it was a young boy, but it was one of the greatest gifts anybody could have given me.
Let's step a little bit away from television, because you just mentioned something a moment ago, that you eventually went into write for Tempo.
Yes.
It takes us to
Right.
the other aspect, the world of journalism.
So I told Funmi that I wanted to be a writer, and she did an introduction to Funmi Iyanda. So I took some of my clippings I had typed out, sent to him. He looked at it, he called the editor and said, this is a smart young man, let's give him a column. So I had a column called Rantings of a Small Boy. And then after that, there was a guest on the New Dawn called Kule Hamilton. He was the editor of Glitterati on Thisday. And so I was writing for Tempo. Tempo was having issues around the time, eventually closed down. And I said to Kule Hamilton, I was a writer. He asked me to send my articles in. I did. And then he gave me a 2-page column in Thisday newspapers at the time. People used to ask me how much I paid Thisday because it was inconceivable for any columnist to have 2 pages and for a teenager to have 2 pages. And so I had that. I had 2 columns actually in Thisday at the time. I had an opinion column and I had an interview column called Sons and Daughters, where I interviewed the children of the rich and successful, famous and successful. And that's how my journalism career started. While doing that, I did an interview with Chimamanda Adichie. She had just written her first book, Purple Hibiscus. Now, her publisher, Mukhtar Bakare Farafina, read the interview and asked for my number and said he wanted to tell me this was one of the best interviews he had ever seen. And then he offered me a job as a writer for his magazine called Farafina at the time. And I did interviews with Hafsat Abiola Costello at the time. I did interviews with Femi Kuti and all of that. Now, when Next Newspapers came, he was one of the founder team of Next Newspapers. And so I was one of the first staff he recommended to Dele Olojede. And I was a hot-headed young man at the time. And so Dele Olojede called me. I had an interesting chat with him where I doubted the future success of this paper. Because by that time, I'd worked in this industry for a long time. And the fundamentals of this industry, I didn't see how it supported the kind of investigative journalism that Next wanted to do. So I said it. You know, when you are younger, you say the things that come to you. And, you know, I didn't get the job. And so, but I loved Next. I loved Next, you know. And so I wanted to, and I was working at the time at Virgin Nigeria. That's the job I took. But I really wanted to work in Next. And so a year later, I reached out to Dele myself for something else. I had seen an example of plagiarism in the newspaper. And I thought, no, Next was too good for this. And so I just noted it to him that was something that's happened. Can you correct it? And so Dele was impressed. And this wasn't the plan. And he called me to the office and offered me a job as a copy editor. And that's how I got into Next. Now, there wasn't a formally constituted editorial board, but they brought a team of editorial writers. And again, I'm not sure who, but either him, no, not him. I think it was Kaderia Ahmed she was the editor-in-chief or the executive editor at the time, the managing editor. And so she asked me to write an editorial one day. I think somebody had fallen ill. And I said, okay, that's fine. I was always up for a challenge. And that's how I wrote my first editorial. She was very impressed. And I remember once they had sent the second or the third editorial across the group. And that's how I joined the editorial team while doing my job as a copy editor. And again, it was one of those great honors because to speak for a newspaper, you know, that's what editorial boards do, that's what editorial writers do. And to be trusted. What I found fascinating about that was nobody told me what to write or how to write it. And again, I was the youngest, you know, copy editor and the youngest editorial writer. And I just thought to myself, I can't believe that I mean, one day, Dele just saw an editorial because you never know who writes what. So he sends it because editorials don't have bylines. And Dele says, this is one of the greatest compliments anybody ever paid me. This is such a great editorial. who wrote this? You deserve a raise.
Let's go back to that and see the progression. And here was this producer with little or no background, had to learn all the ropes right there and to take massive decisions at critical moments. And that, to an extent, would seem like what shaped you and was the driving force behind going on to have your own.
Absolutely. So first, again, I always have interesting stories. I am a creator of a show on Channels TV called Rubbin Minds. So what had happened was we set up a business with my co-founders. Two of them had a show on the NTA called Youth Talk that was being produced, I think, by Ibrahim Suleiman in the NTA 2 Channel 5, Emilia and Adebola. And so when we came together from a business, we wanted to do a TV show. And so John Momo, the founder of Channels, had supported our other projects, the Future Awards Africa, and we had an event called Rubbin Minds. And so one day he said, you know, you can make this into a TV special. And I think we did a live TV special. And after that, we went to him and said, okay, since you've offered this to us, we actually have a TV show idea, a youth TV show idea. And John Momo has been a steady supporter of mine and ours for over 20 years, Mr. John Momo, OON. And he gave us a TV show, you know. This was in 2007 or 8. And it's still running till now. It's now hosted by Ebuka Obi-Uchendu. It's one of the longest running independent TV shows. So I hosted that show for about 2 or 3 years. But it didn't feel like a fit for me. It was more of a news show. And I wanted to bring more personality into this. And so I eventually went and met the host, the lead host, Ebuka, and offered him the job, you know, and took a back seat as producer, which was comfortable for me. And so at a point I dabbled into a show, but I was so busy running the business, I didn't have the time. I thought to myself, I had to choose, you know, I had to be disciplined enough to choose. So I stayed behind the cameras from about 2010 up until 2019 when I recorded the first episode of my show, I think. But I think it was inevitable because, again, my TV experience is very wide-ranging. I produced shows for Comfort Okoronkwo, Video 10 on NTA, it was on the network. I produced shows for Lillian Agbaso, Health Plus on NTA. I produced Inside Out with Agatha for a number of years. I was production coordinating and I was producer. So I had worked in television and talk shows were my life. And so I think that it was inevitable that I was going to come back and do my own talk show.
All right.
Yes. Then in 2018, I decided I was going to do with Chude. 2019, I recorded the first episode that was broadcast, and it's been on there.
I'm not sure if you've had time to think about it. Young men do a lot of things. When did you get to do the young men things? You know what I'm talking about. Did you ever do that?
I'd say yes, but not a lot. And that's part of, you know, that's part of what my book explores that's coming out later in the year. The work was a lot of my life because I started working at the age of 15. And I was so driven, you know, I was so driven and so focused. And I tried to mix it up, but work was 90% of my life. And so at some point in my 20s, I had a nervous breakdown because it was just too much pressure. And I actually had to go see a doctor who had to force me to go and rest. And even in resting, I still didn't rest. I went and became a secondary school teacher at my alma mater in Mayflower. You know, that was the best rest I could. And because of that, I had now in my late 20s had to restructure my life. And so after that, I took the first vacation in my life, in my late 20s. And then I began to take regular vacations. And I began to rest more. The way I was going, if I had been allowed to keep going that way, I wouldn't have had any memories of being a young man to enjoy. What I learned was to balance it with play. So I don't joke with my rests. I don't joke with my friends. I don't joke with my family. I spend the holidays with my mom. I don't joke with myself and my friends are going on a trip for my birthday. I don't joke with my faith, you know. So now what my late 20s did was teach me how to integrate the important things in my life.
Where is money in all of this?
I wasn't expecting that. So two things have happened at the same time. I remember in 2000, I joined the Association of Nigerian Authors. And I sat in, and this is a very formative memory, and I sat in a meeting with them. And I was worried about poverty. Because authors are not well respected in Nigeria. And I could see that this could be my life, And I knew that I couldn't afford to be poor in a country like Nigeria. There's no social safety net, there was none of those things. And it was in the Anna meetings in Bode Thomas that I made a decision that I had to have a good life to be able to do the things I wanted to do. So two things have happened at the same time. I have been conscious of money because of the country I am in. But I've also never made decisions because of money. Case in point, I was working in Virgin Nigeria. I always tell this story. When I came out of NYSC, I had 5 job offers. And I chose the least paying one, Virgin Nigeria, because it was more fun. And when I left Virgin Nigeria to Next Newspapers, I had an offer from the biggest telecoms company in the country. And Next was already owing salaries. But I chose Next. So I've always been conscious of money, but I've never chosen the biggest amount of money. And I think, when I tell young people, I say, no, the lesson is not to choose poverty. The lesson is not to care about money. The lesson is that money cannot be the number one, the only driver of your decision making. I've been conscious especially in the media. Especially the media. The media, because I sat down, I remember I was telling Dr. Rubbin I remember sitting down and listening to a conversation between himself, Eniola Bello, Funmi Iyanda, Dele Alake in NTA as a teenager. And thinking, no, this industry can crush me if I don't pay. And I would watch stars and I would see them in penury, people who were the hugely talented people. And I made a commitment it wasn't going to be me. Because the one thing that has excited me is media. And so it became media and politics. How do you do this? And that became exciting. But it was never about the politician. And it was easy for me. So when I worked for Dr. Goodluck Jonathan, his campaign,
yes,
I was working directly with Oronto Douglas of blessed memory. And that was when I got my first invitation to join government. And I said no, because that wasn't the joy of it. The joy of it was working on the media. And then when the Buhari government, when I worked on the campaign, and I got my second and my third offers, it was very easy to say no, because that wasn't the thing. The politics was not the attraction. The media was the attraction.
Sometimes the politics puts across a message.
Yes.
The media carries that message. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And sometimes the message could be at variance with principles and beliefs. Yeah. So how do you balance that?
I leave. I leave. That's what has always happened. If the principles clash with the mission, which is media, I leave. And I just leave. Again, I learned it because I started very young. And my mentors, I watched their model. And the model was always build a business, a brand, so that you can leave whenever you choose.
What I'd like you to talk about is the story of the international exposure. And what that has done for you. The homeboy suddenly is playing on the international turf. Yeah. There's a difference to that. And what's left to see?
What's left to see is more and more. There's so much. Like I said, I'm still that young boy in secondary school who wanted to do a lot of things. And right now, I deliberately have disciplined myself over the past 5 years. Even though, I continue to work internationally, now I'm working with the London School of Economics and all of that. Now I want to tell African stories and global stories to the world. That's where we are going from 2025. I was waiting to turn 40 to do that. But this is what I'm most proud of. And anybody has monitored my social media posts since the year started, I'm a completely made in Nigeria product. Completely. Born, bred, and buttered in Nigeria. I went to primary school in Nigeria. I went to secondary schools in Nigeria. I had my first degree in Nigeria. I had my second degree in Nigeria. I didn't leave Nigeria until I was 24, 25 for the first time. You know, none of my parents had traveled. I was young.
There are people who would say to you, the first time they set foot out of this country was when they were 50, 60. Here's a 24-year-old.
Well, true that.
All right.
But before, yes, but because my parents were hardworking and were comfortable, and they tried to take me to the best schools. And so I was constantly surrounded, even though they pushed themselves to enable that. So I was really surrounded by, what we called, when we were going on, the Ajabota children, who were going on holidays, all around the world. And I couldn't even think of that, talk less of affording that. And when I go around the world, I have a very rooted Nigerian perspective, and I'm very proud of it, I always joke with people. I say, look, I'm not in a fight against what they now call white privilege. I'm rooted in my privilege as a black person, as a Nigerian person. And to be a Nigerian product going around the world is what I'm proudest of. It's not that I'm going around the world. It's that I was formed in Nigeria, despite its challenges, despite, I always say that I never spent time in the library when I was at Unilag. It was too full. I used to joke that if all of us who were law students attended classes, the classes would not be able to contain us. So we thank God for the trance. I went through that system, the hostels, the bad toilets, the teachers who were teaching English and couldn't speak good English sometimes. I went through all of that. And I still managed to compete internationally. That is what I'm proud of. And that's the story that I most want to tell. That even in the midst of incredible difficulty, in the midst of an industry that is not as respected as it should be, one can still change the world.
There's a little story I'd like to tell you.
Okay, sir.
And wonder what you'd make of that.
Right.
Many years ago, I used to go up to drop 2 young children in a certain school called Kekotun. I just might have missed some young pupil of that school who I am now sitting with. Once again, happy birthday.
Thank you, sir.
Chude. Just that I'm not quite sure when they sing the traditional birthday song, when they say, how old are you now? And you say, I'm 40. And someone said, no, hang on a moment. The body is 40. Something in the mind that's pushing 60, And so how do the two get together? How do they manage this? And the head that knows so much and is packed in so much. Is there some struggle going on? Slow down a bit. Smell the roses.
I will take that advice. I remember when I was young, when I started my career, Funmi used to tell me, you are 13 going on 30. Those sound like the good old days now. But yes, I mean, doing this is part of my my practice, which is, one of my values is humility and learning. And the reason why you would say that, I think, is because I spend a lot of time listening. I spend a lot of time with older people. I spend a lot of time listening to older people. I spent time. I'll just go and learn. I'd go and ask Mr. John Momo, I just made this success, but I want to know how to manage it. And he would say, come over to the office and we'll spend hours talking. And those things are not for social media. They are for my edification. And if I have any wisdom, it's because of that. Turning 40, it's very easy to get lost in the fact that, you're the rave of the moment. But the moments have had many raves. The moments have had many raves. And I'm conscious of that. And I want to learn from that. I want to be grounded with that. And so even having this interview, I grew up watching you even until date. And I wanted to do this for that reason, because people were here before me. People have done things I can't even imagine. You're talking about global recognition. You've gone across the world, doing this when the competition was stiffer, when there were less opportunities. And I don't take it for granted, the learnings that I learned from people like you. Take it for granted. I was watching the video of yourself visiting TVC studios. And that kind of relevance and reverence doesn't come by being full of yourself. It comes from doing the work. And those are the careers that inspire me. Those are the stories that ground me. And so if you're saying that I'm 40 going on 60, it's because I watch people like you, and I learn from people like you, and I hope to keep learning from people like you.
Chude, congratulations.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you.
Keep the stories coming.
Thank you. Thank you.